At the will reading, the sound that struck hardest wasn't the lawyer's voice, it was my parents laughing as they handed my sister a check for $6,900,000. Then, a single dollar bill slid toward me, crisp and mocking. My father didn't blink when he said, "Go earn your own." My mother smirked, almost pleased with herself. "Some kids just don't measure up," she added. No one disagreed, not even my sister. I stayed silent, taking the dollar and the sealed letter my grandfather had left, only for and bun, bun, and bun. Welcome to Turning Tables Stories channel. I'm settling in with a warm coffee and the view, reflecting on how some silences are heavier than others. Today's journey starts in that cold, quiet space. Where are you listening from, and what's your favorite drink right now? Let's return to the story as I drive away from Pacific Heights toward the truth waiting in Oakland. I didn't wait for the toast. I didn't wait for the fake "I'm so sorry" looks from Ashley. I walked out of that mahogany-paneled room and into the cool San Francisco fog. The silence of the hallway was a familiar weight, but for the first time, it didn't feel like a burden. It felt like armor. My mother's laughter followed me to the door, a sharp, brittle sound that echoed the emptiness of the home I was leaving behind. I didn't look back. Looking back is for those who still hope for a different ending. I reached my car, a modest sedan that looked like a smudge in the driveway full of six-figure vehicles, and I simply drove. Every mile I put between myself and Pacific Heights felt like a credit on a ledger that had been in the red for 2 decades. I checked into a small inn in Oakland. The air here smelled like salt and reality, not the suffocating perfume of my parents' pretense. The owner recognized me, but knew better than to ask questions. I walked into my room, set the $1 bill on the desk, and finally opened the envelope from my grandfather, Thomas. There were no stacks of bills inside. There was no sudden fortune to replace the $6,900,000 they'd just handed to my sister. There was no sudden fortune to replace that staggering windfall they'd just handed to Ashley. Instead, there was a single sheet of paper with a string of numbers, coordinates, and one line in his steady, old-fashioned handwriting. The truth only reveals itself when you observe what others ignore. I sat there for a long time, tracing the ink. For years, I had trained as an investigative journalist. I'd learned to follow the paper trail, to find the cracks in the narrative, and to wait for the moment the mask slipped. My family saw my career as a quirky hobby or a disappointment. They thought I was just the quiet, sensible daughter who could be easily erased. But standing in that room, I realized Thomas hadn't just left me coordinates. He had left me an opening. He knew I was the only one in that family who knew how to look beneath the surface. My parents and my sister were blinded by the glare of their own reflection. They were so busy being important that they'd forgotten how to be careful. I pulled my laptop from my bag. This wasn't a moment for tears. It was a moment for an audit. The numbers on the page didn't look like coordinates for a physical location to me. They looked like ledger entries. They looked like dates. My grandfather hadn't just given me a letter, he had given me the key to the vault where my parents had hidden their conscience. And I was going to make sure every single one of their secrets was brought into the light. I began to type. The investigative skills they mocked were about to become their greatest liability. In the world of facts and figures, there is no such thing as being invisible. Everything leaves a trace. And I was going to follow theirs until there was nothing left of the life they thought they deserved. I looked at that $1 bill sitting on the oak desk of the inn, and for the first time, I didn't see a mockery. I saw a receipt. It was the final payment for 29 years of invisible labor. My parents, Kenneth and Jennifer, had spent decades trying to convince me that I was a liability, but as I opened my laptop, I realized I had actually been their most profitable, silent investor. I remember a Tuesday afternoon when I was 17. I had just come home from the county science fair with a blue ribbon for a project on sustainable water infrastructure. It was the first thing I'd ever built that felt entirely mine. Jennifer didn't even look at the ribbon. She didn't ask how the presentation went. She simply picked it up from the side table and tossed it into the kitchen trash to make room for Ashley's latest third-place piano trophy. I watched it fall between coffee grounds and eggshells, and I didn't say a word. At the time, I thought my silence was a symptom of my failure to be enough. But as I look back now, through the lens of my professional instincts in forensic reporting, I see it differently. That was the moment I began to develop what I call the invisible chains of the survivor. When you live in a house where your existence is treated as an overhead cost they refuse to pay, you learn to survive by becoming a shadow. You stop asking for permission to be seen and start observing. You inhabit the corners of the room, hearing the whispers they think the walls are too thick to carry. My parents thought they were erasing me, but they were actually giving me a front row seat to their decay. Because I was just Victoria, I was the one who managed the crises. Ashley was too important to handle. I was the placeholder who returned the forgotten items and walked the dogs. And in that role, I saw the first leaks in Kenneth's empire. When I was 24, I noticed the first set of rounded payments in his firm's accounts. $10,000 here, $15,000 there. I brought him the spreadsheets. I tried to warn him that his advisors were bleeding him dry. He didn't even look up from his scotch. He told me I didn't have the mind for real business and told me to go back to my little articles. My warning was an investment that yielded zero return, and he dismissed me as easily as Jennifer had dismissed that blue ribbon years before. But that's the trap of normalizing cruelty. They were so comfortable using me as a doormat that they forgot I was the only one in the house who knew how to read a balance sheet. Kenneth and Jennifer had convinced themselves that their status was inherent, but I knew it was a subscription they were struggling to pay. Anger wasn't loud this time. It was clinical. I rubbed my eyes, and there was no regret. This wasn't a family drama anymore, it was an audit, and the interest on 20 years of neglect had finally come due. I wasn't just a daughter anymore, I was the debt collector. The screen of my phone glowed in the dim light of the inn, a window into a world I had already decided to dismantle. Ashley had already posted her victory lap on TikTok. The video showed her twirling in the grand foyer of the Pacific Heights mansion, clutching that $6,900,000 check like a golden ticket. The caption was a direct echo of my mother's toxicity. Some were born for the spotlight, others for the shadows. 6,900,000 reasons to stay winning. My parents had already commented beneath it, calling her their golden girl. I didn't feel the sting of her words. I felt the vibration of a liability. As I watched the likes climb into the thousands, I realized Ashley's influencer brand was built on the same hollow foundation as Kenneth's consulting firm. They were performing wealth while I was auditing its expiration date. I turned my attention back to the coordinates and the data Thomas had left me. As I dug into the recent filings of Kenneth's company, the real business he claimed I couldn't understand the cracks became canyons. The company wasn't just struggling, it was an empty shell. Kenneth and Jennifer had been liquidating every asset they could touch to maintain the facade of a Pacific Heights lifestyle, but they were drowning in high-interest bridge loans. The mansion itself was already under a pre-foreclosure notice, and that $6,900,000 was their last desperate hope to stop the bank from seizing the gates. But the most devastating discovery wasn't the debt, it was the betrayal. I found the encrypted email chains tucked away in a subfolder titled Legacy Management. My parents were in secret negotiations to sell Thomas's life, work his medical patents, to a predatory conglomerate known for burying innovations to protect their profits. Thomas had built those patents with one goal: to serve the community and make healthcare accessible. He had specifically structured his research fund to ensure they would never be sold for a private windfall. But to Kenneth and Jennifer, those patents weren't a legacy, they were a life raft. They were preparing to sell the soul of Thomas's work, to save their own social standing. This is the trap of normalizing cruelty. When you spend years treating people like placeholders and assets, you eventually lose the ability to see anything else. To my parents, Thomas was no longer their father or mentor. He was a ledger to be settled. They had normalized the idea that his final wishes were secondary to their need for new luxury cars and designer wardrobes. They were suffering from what I recognized as a deep narcissistic injury. My independence, my refusal to beg for a place at their table, was a threat to the narrative they had constructed. They needed me to be the worthless burden so they could feel like the generous providers. They used the term family like a contract, but they were the only ones allowed to edit the terms. I felt a cold, sharp clarity settle into my bones. My father had told me to go earn my own, but he was the one living on stolen time and embezzled dreams. He was liquidating a $500 million research foundation to pay for a $6,900,000 performance. He was liquidating a $500 million research foundation just to fund a nearly $7 million charade. I stopped scrolling. I didn't need to see any more TikToks or read any more fake apologies. I went back to my spreadsheet, my fingers moving with the precision of a surgeon. This wasn't revenge. This was a hostile takeover of a narrative that had never belonged to them in the first place. Inside my room, my laptop glowed with a different kind of sunrise, the kind made of facts, numbers, and quiet retribution. I didn't sneak back into the Pacific Heights mansion under the cover of darkness. I didn't need to. I walked through the front doors at 10 in the morning, my footsteps echoing against the marble that my grandfather's hard work had paid for. Kenneth and Jennifer were in the breakfast nook, likely discussing how to spend the first million of Ashley's inheritance. When they saw me, my mother didn't even put down her crystal glass of juice. She just looked at my sensible shoes and sighed. Back for more, Victoria? I told you that dollar was final. I didn't answer her. I didn't need their permission. I was there under the legal provision of my $1 inheritance, which allowed me to retrieve any personal research materials my grandfather had designated for me. I had Mr. Boone Thomas's longtime attorney standing right behind me. His presence was a silent gavel that Kenneth couldn't ignore. My father's face went a shade of purple that matched his silk tie, but he stayed in his chair. He thought I was there to collect old notebooks and half-finished sketches. He had no idea I was there to perform a forensic audit on his life. We moved to the library. The room smelled of cedar, old paper, and the heavy weight of secrets. I walked straight to the mahogany desk and knelt beside the locked cabinet Thomas had always touched before leaving the room. I pulled out the bronze key, the one they had overlooked, because they were too busy counting $6,900,000. I pulled out the bronze key, the one they had overlooked, because they were too blinded by the glare of that stolen fortune. It clicked open with a sound that felt like a sentence being passed. Inside were binders labeled by year. I didn't just find research. I found the roadmap to their betrayal. Marcus, my closest friend and a specialist in probate fraud, was waiting for my call. As I digitized the pages, he began to thread the needle. We didn't find mistakes. We found a system. For 10 years, Kenneth and Jennifer had been siphoning money from Thomas's research fund into a shell entity called KJ Legacy Holdings. They weren't just greedy, they were embezzlers. Every rounded payment I had noticed years ago was there, but now I had the signatures. I saw my father's initials on advisory memos that intentionally devalued Thomas's patents so the shell company could buy the rights for pennies. They'd been stealing from a dying man to fund a lifestyle they couldn't afford. My compassion for them had been a luxury they'd overdrafted for years, but the account was now closed. This wasn't a breakdown, it was a balance sheet. I looked at the screen of my tablet, where the numbers were finally turning red for them. They had spent decades treating me like a placeholder, the invisible daughter who didn't measure up. But in their arrogance, they had left the most dangerous person in the room unmonitored. I wasn't just a journalist anymore, I was the auditor of their ruin. As we packed the digital files, I felt a strange sense of stillness. I looked at the hidden camera Thomas had installed in the corner, a tiny lens that had recorded their every greedy move in this very room. The truth is only effective when the right people see it, and I was about to make sure the entire world got a front row seat. I stood up, gripped the key in my hand, and walked out without a word. The audit was complete. Now it was time for the reckoning. I sat in the quiet of my Oakland room, the air smelling of old paper and the sharp metallic tang of the microscope on my desk. My parents' laughter still echoed in the back of my mind, a toxic soundtrack to the most important audit of my life. I looked at the $1 bill they had pushed across that mahogany table with such smug satisfaction. "Go earn your own," my father had said. I was about to do exactly that, but on a scale he couldn't comprehend. I carefully placed the dollar under the lens. Thomas was a man of science, a man who valued the details others ignored. He wouldn't have left a mockery, unless it was a test. As the image sharpened, the truth came into focus. The dollar bill wasn't the inheritance. It was a map. Under the microscope, I saw microprinting along the border of the bill coordinates to a private vault built into the base of Thomas's old microscope case. Inside that hidden compartment sat the real treasure, an 1804 silver dollar, preserved in a vacuum-sealed slab. In the world of numismatics, this is the king of American coins. Thomas hadn't given me a dollar. He had given me an asset worth over $10 million. But the financial windfall was only half the puzzle. I turned my attention to the digital folder Marcus had just uploaded. It contained the final documents from the cabinet Thomas had kept locked for 30 years. I scrolled past the embezzlement records and the shell company's signatures until I hit a file labeled Confidential Genetic Audit. I read the DNA results with clinical precision. My hands didn't shake. I didn't feel sadness. I felt the click of a balance sheet finally being settled. Kenneth Hartman, the man who defined himself by Hartman prestige, the man who called me an outsider because I didn't fit his mold, was not a biological Hartman. He was not my grandfather's son. The realization was devastating in its irony. Kenneth and Jennifer had spent my entire life erasing me, telling me I didn't measure up to the family name. Yet, they were the ones who had no legitimate claim to it at all. They were the real placeholders, occupying a mansion and a legacy built on a lie. I looked at the bylaws of the Hartman Research Foundation. Thomas had designed them with lethal foresight. The controlling interest and the $500 million endowment were strictly reserved for direct biological descendants of Thomas Hartman. By forging signatures to sell those patents and embezzling from the research fund, Kenneth had violated the integrity clause of the will. The unqualified child was the only Hartman left in the room. I closed my laptop. The blue light faded, leaving me in the salt-tinged dark of the Oakland night. Kenneth and Jennifer were currently celebrating their spotlight moment with Ashley, unaware that their spotlight was about to become an interrogation lamp. They weren't Hartman heirs. They were simply criminals who had siphoned a legacy for long enough. I touched the 1804 silver dollar. This coin wasn't just a trophy, it was my collateral. By verifying its existence to the estate's private bank, I unlocked a massive line of credit to fund this legal takeover. The DNA report was my weapon, but this coin was my war chest. This wasn't a family dispute anymore, it was an eviction, and I was going to make sure they never saw it coming. The mansion was alive with the sound of a victory that didn't belong to them. Crystal glasses clinked, and the air was thick with the scent of expensive catering and the shallow laughter of people who believed they had finally won. Kenneth and Jennifer were at the center of the room, holding court with representatives from the conglomerate they were selling my grandfather's patents to. They were celebrating the liquidation of a legacy. I didn't wait for an introduction. I walked in with the authority of a primary stakeholder, flanked by the estate's lead attorney and a private security detail. Jennifer tried to scream for the guards, but I simply held up the temporary restraining order. "This is my house now, Mother. You are the intruder." The room went quiet, as if someone had sucked the oxygen out of the space. Jennifer was the first to speak, her voice dripping with that familiar, polished venom. "Victoria, I thought we made it clear that your presence was no longer required. Haven't you spent that dollar yet?" I didn't answer her. I looked at the representatives from the conglomerate and spoke with clinical precision. "I hope you haven't signed anything yet, because the people you are negotiating with have no legal authority to sell those patents. Kenneth stepped forward, his face turning a dangerous shade of red. That is enough. You are making a scene. I'm not making a scene, Kenneth. I'm performing a final audit on your career. My investigators have already submitted these embezzlement records to FINRA and the SEC. By the time the police arrive, your license to practice as a financial advisor will be permanently revoked. And that's just the professional side. Outside, there are 2 detectives from the San Francisco Police Department's fraud unit. Probate fraud on this scale is a felony. Kenneth, you won't just be poor. You'll be in a jumpsuit that matches your bitterness. Mr. Boone stepped forward and placed a digital tablet on the central table right next to their celebratory champagne. He pressed play. The room filled with Kenneth's voice, recorded by the hidden camera in Thomas's study, the same study where they had spent years siphoning funds into KJ Legacy Holdings. They heard themselves discussing the forgery of my grandfather's signature. They heard Jennifer laughing about how they would leave me with nothing. Jennifer's composure cracked. She lunged toward the tablet, but an investigator moved to block her. "This is taken out of context," she shrieked. "We are your parents. We raised you." "Parents protect their children," I said, looking her in the eye. "They don't treat them as overhead costs to be minimized. And as for the Hartman name," I pulled the genetic audit from the folder and slid it across the marble. "Thomas knew the truth long before he died. Kenneth, you are not a biological Hartman. Under the ironclad lineage clause of the Hartman Family Trust, your status as an heir and your authority as executor is legally void. You aren't just an outsider. You are a trespasser who committed probate fraud to bypass my grandfather's bloodline requirements." The silence that followed was absolute. Kenneth looked like a man who had just seen the floor disappear beneath his feet. Ashley stood in the background, her phone forgotten, realizing her $6,900,000 lifestyle was evaporating in real time. "Because you violated the integrity clause and engaged in fraud against the estate, every asset has already defaulted to the Research Foundation," I continued. "The mansion, the accounts, the cars, everything. And since I am the sole trustee, I have already initiated the next step." I handed Jennifer the white envelope containing the eviction notice. I handed Jennifer the legal notice. Since the deed was secured through forgery, the title is frozen. I've secured an emergency injunction. This mansion is now a contested asset under federal audit. You have 48 hours to pack your personal belongings before the locks are changed for the duration of the investigation. The 48 hours passed in a flurry of movers and desperate, unanswered phone calls. Kenneth and Jennifer were forced into a small, 2-bedroom rental in an Oakland neighborhood they once openly mocked from their high-rise offices. Their names, once symbols of prestige in Pacific Heights, have become social poison among the San Francisco elite. Ashley's influencer brand did not survive the viral scandal of the embezzled research funds. The very audience she sought for validation became the ones to expose the hollow foundation of her spotlight life. I stood on the balcony of the Hartman Research Foundation, the $500 million endowment now safely under my control and protection. The San Francisco fog rolled in over the bay, cool and honest, exactly as my grandfather would have liked it. The first thing I did as trustee was establish the Thomas Legacy for Investigative Ethics, and a center to support children who grew up in houses where they were treated as placeholders rather than people. Looking out over the water, I realized I had finally moved from being a survivor to being a sower. There is a specific kind of satisfaction in what I call the justice of the sower. Most people think justice is about the crash, the moment the villains lose their house or their money. And while that provides a momentary high, it is the justice of punishment, which is always anchored in the past. True justice, the kind that heals, is found in what you build next. By turning my parents' greed into a resource for others, I didn't just punish them, I made their choices irrelevant to my future. I've come to realize that family is not a DNA contract. It is not a debt you owe to the people who raised you if they spent those years trying to erase your identity. Family is a series of choices. a collection of intentional actions that say, I see you and you matter. If you find yourself in a similar situation, if you are the one sitting at the far end of the table while others are celebrated, remember this: your value is not a consensus. It does not require a majority vote from the people in your living room. Sometimes, the best revenge is not a loud explosion or a public fight. It is the quiet, methodical building of a beautiful life they can no longer touch. Forgiveness is not always for the other person. Sometimes it is the only way to set yourself free from the balance sheet of their expectations. I walked back inside, the bronze key from Thomas still heavy in my pocket. The silence of the mansion was different now. It wasn't the cold silence of being ignored, it was the peace of being known. My grandfather was right. Stillwater tells the truth, if you know how to listen. He knew that simply disinheriting them wouldn't stop them. They would have fought me in court for decades. He needed them to commit the crime themselves, to sign those forged papers after his death. He set a trap that only their own greed could spring, ensuring that when I finally took the lead, the law would be my shield, not my obstacle. And for the first time in my life, I am finally listening to my own voice. If this story helped you realize your true worth, please share it with someone who needs the strength to stand tall today. Don't forget to like and subscribe to join our community and catch our next journeys for justice.